Hi everyone, thanks for joining me. This is a CIMA E2 video sample for the APC Super Summary series. And in this particular video sample, we're going to look at Porter's diamond model. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is to take you through a content summary, really to give you a feel for what we're going to be covering over the next 15 minutes or so. And it's important for your success in your CIMA exams that you really have a good feel for the elements of each model within the CIMA E2 syllabus. You'll also see those same models within the E3 syllabus. And moving on from an understanding of the mechanics of the model, you've got to be able to apply those models to different scenarios and hopefully in your business life. It's only by getting a deeper level understanding of each of the models that you'll be able to deal with the models within the real exam. Okay, so our first port of call in terms of this particular screencast is to give you a fix on the contents. The first thing we're going to do is just fit in Porter's diamond to the CIMA E2 syllabus and how it works. I'll take you through a little bit of background on Michael Porter and why you should listen to him. We'll move then on to the model itself, its elements, and an explanation of how it works. We'll then give you a real-life example, in our case, the German car industry. And then we'll move on to some practice MCQ questions. And it's so important in your studies that you practice questions as often as possible. And then I'll finalize with a summary and a recap. So, in terms of this introduction, well, I guess the important thing for us to understand is that your CIMA E2 examiner is trying to test whether or not you understand what he means by gaining a holistic view of strategic management. What does that mean? Well, essentially that means that we must view management as a series of many different parts, and we have to understand that management must determine and assess everything around them, including the macro environment. And how do they do that? Well, really, they use tools, techniques, and indeed models. What they're trying to do with those tools and techniques and models is really to assess the competitive environment. In other words, assess what's going on around them and really try to explain it. One of the key models, obviously, is Porter's diamond. It's core to your E-stream studies, in particular E2 and E3 as mentioned. And it's important for you, as I've mentioned, is to understand how these models work in the real world and to gain a deep level understanding. So, moving on from the introduction, Michael Porter. Why should you listen to what Michael Porter says? Well, there's a number of reasons. When Michael Porter speaks, people listen. He is a leading authority on the competitive environment and on competitive strategy for businesses. His background is in Harvard Business School. He still teaches there. He's also worked at Princeton. So his key book over the last 30 years is on the right-hand side here, The Competitive Advantage of Nations. And that's where Porter's diamond comes from. And within that book, he really details, what are the main factors that make one nation more competitive in a particular field or industry to another. And it's so important, as mentioned within your E-stream studies, that you recognize that Porter's diamond, and indeed everything that Porter says, is central. It's an examiner favorite. Other areas that you might consider outside of Porter's diamond is Porter's 5 forces and indeed the value chain. So really, in summary, it's so important that you understand what Porter means by his diamond, his 5 forces in the value chain, and make sure that you're able to apply those to as many different scenarios as possible. So in terms of the constituent elements of Porter's diamond, I'm going to take you through 4 main areas. Firstly, the definition. Secondly, an explanation of the theory, the mechanics of the model itself. Thirdly, some limitations, and then a quick summary. So, in terms of the definition of the model, what Porter is trying to do is to explain how particular nations have some form of comparative competitive advantage over other nations. If you think about perhaps the German car industry as an example and its development over the last 100 years, why is it that Germany has such a plethora, such a large number of premium car brands? Was that luck? What was in play? And really what Porter does is he says that there are a series of factors, he calls them determinants, that come into play and that have come into play over the last 90, 100 years to make the German car industry develop more quickly than its neighboring rivals and to become what's known today as probably the premium country in the world for car manufacture. So this word competitive advantage, what does that mean? Well, that just basically means an edge. It means some sort of advantage over another firm or perhaps a set of firms in a neighboring country. Now, in terms of the model itself, you'll see that obviously it's set up as a diamond and it has four main areas: factor conditions, related and supporting industries, demand conditions, and firm strategy, structure, and rivalry. And what Porter is saying here is that each of these elements come together and sort of interplay, impact upon each other to drive a particular industry in a particular country. And certainly what happened within the German car industry is that each of these factors, each of these determinants or elements were in play to develop the car industry fairly quickly to become really, as I've said, the premium car nation in the world as of today. So let's deal with each of the factors one by one. So in terms of factor conditions, really, I'll ask you to note firstly that this area of factor conditions is broken down into two parts: basic and advanced. And on the right hand side here, I've got a series of images for you that hopefully will help you to remember these areas. But in terms of basic factors, what we're saying is that there are some items that are naturally occurring in some countries, but not in others, that lend themselves to particular types of industries. Okay, so we see here just literally climate, and then moving on from there, perhaps some naturally occurring, perhaps not iron ore or steel, and then over and above that, really unskilled labor. So really what we're saying here is that, there are a series of what you would call very basic, naturally occurring factors that can help particular industries grow perhaps more quickly than a neighboring country or nation. Over and above that, in terms of the advanced factors, I'd ask you to note here that really what we're talking about is man-made items. So we're saying in the first instance, perhaps maybe some know-how or technical expertise. And you only have to think really of World War I, the German Luftwaffe, and really the similarities between a plane and a car. So as you can imagine, going back to the 1920s and 30s, there were in fact, a number of experts in particular fields, perhaps engine making, perhaps tire making, etc., etc. So there was a certain amount of expertise really inherent within Germany before the development of the German car industry. Over and above that, remember we're talking about man-made factors here. Here what we're talking about is infrastructure. In other words, roads and rail. So really what we're saying is that, the transport infrastructure, for example, was such that it was just that little bit easier for Germany as opposed to a neighboring country to transport components, parts from one place to the other because it had a very, very good structure to its transport network. Over and above that, in terms of infrastructure, really telecommunications. Telecommunications are key, again man-made. So really what we're saying is that these advanced factors, being man-made, really helped the German car industry to usurp their neighbors. Now, moving on from factor conditions to related and supporting industries. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, again, if I use the German car industry as an example, you'll see that what we mean is that if you think back to the 1920s, there would have been a number of industries. In fact, there was probably 200 plus firms that were involved in the automotive industry and indeed the aircraft industry. Now, what those firms will have done is a certain amount of sharing of knowledge, a certain amount of mutual support. And in effect, what we're saying is that there were clusters of small firms within related industries really giving support to each other and really, as we said here, deriving strength from their links. So the key word for us is certainly clusters, but I guess the key thing is that these firms helped each other. Yeah, they needed to, and they did. Okay. So moving on from there, in terms of the demand area or demand conditions, one key problem or key mistake that I've seen students make in this area of the diamond is to assume that when we mean demand, or when we say demand, we're talking about volume. In other words, let's say if there's a high demand, the industry is going to grow. Well, that's not necessarily the case. And it's certainly not the case within the diamond. What Porter is referring to here is the extent to which businesses, or indeed firms within a particular industry, learn from their consumers. In other words, it's the sophistication of the consumer demand that's important, not just volume. I mean, volume is required. Obviously, the larger the volume of demand, the better it is for firms, but it's really what those firms learn from their customers. And what they learn tends to drive innovation and obviously quality. Okay, so key word there for us is the sophistication of the consumer demand. In terms of strategy, structure, and rivalry, this is probably the area of the diamond that students find sort of difficult to understand. So let me break it down for you. Really what we're saying here is, what is it about a particular nation's sort of culture or management style that lends itself to particular types of industries? Now, you'll probably be familiar with a theorist called Handy and his definition of culture. His definition is that basically culture means the way we do business around here. And in essence, what we're saying under this heading is that the way that the Germans did business, the way that they strategized, the way that they structured their business or their businesses was such that it lent itself to the sort of fast growth of fledgling companies within a fledgling industry. Now, certainly the strategy of German car manufacturers in the 1920s was all based around quality, albeit at a level that was lower than what we'd expect today, but certainly they were interested in quality. Their strategy was to make a quality product. Now, in terms of this structure area here, really what we're saying is that it just happened that the way that German car firms, Mercedes, Porsche, etc., were structured, perhaps the way that they made decisions, perhaps their relationship with banks was such that developing an industry was a lot easier than perhaps firms in a neighboring country. And then obviously this third one here, fairly self-explanatory, rivalry. Albeit for the fact that we talked in the previous slide about mutual support, certainly the more manufacturers that you have in a given industry, the more rivalry you have, it's got to help the development of the particular industry. Okay, so limitations of the model. Now there are several. One really, really obvious one is the fact that Porter's Diamond, and indeed the Competitive Advantage of Nations first edition, was written in the 1980s. Now, the business landscape at that time was completely different. There was no internet, for example. So if you can imagine a situation where Porter is developing his thesis on Porter's Diamond, he didn't understand at that point what was going to happen in business over the next 30 or 40 years. So really what people say is, well, this model is a little bit old. It's a little bit old to apply now. I still think it does have its uses, and certainly your CIMA E2 examiner uses it regularly. But if you were asked to criticize it, I would certainly say that it's certainly geared towards product-based, perhaps 1980s style businesses rather than current businesses that can exist in the cloud, for example. The other point that I think is important is that the role of government is underplayed within the model. Although Porter does mention government and government intervention, he doesn't make it a core element of the model. And some people would say, well, governments can play quite a significant part in the development or non-development of a particular industry, for example, by applying or supplying subsidies to different companies. The next point here is in relation to multinationals, and as you'd appreciate, multinationals have developed considerably over the last sort of 30 or 40 years. They will have been in play, they will have existed in the 1980s, but a multinational company may not be overly concerned about factor conditions within a given country if they're looking to deploy resources there or expand overseas, because they may well bring their own resources, their own funds, their own technical know-how and skills. They may not be overly bothered about whether or not a particular country or firms within it have access to technical know-how. They'll bring their own. Okay, so do be aware of limitations, not just with Porter's Diamond, but with any model. Always have within your notes a section that criticizes each of the models that you're trying to fathom out. So in terms of a summary here, first thing I'll draw your attention to is that Homer is reminding us that Porter does in fact talk within the competitive advantage of nations of two other points, perhaps our fifth and sixth points outside of the diamond. He talks about government intervention, or indeed lack of it, playing a role, but he also talks about chance events, literally luck. So really what he's saying is that, sometimes just a little bit of luck within industry helps its development. And he does mention government intervention, but obviously he doesn't make it core to the model, and that's a criticism of it. So in terms of a summary here, I think the key point for us is to really say, well, we have a model that has a set of determinants or indeed elements. We need to learn them. We need to learn the buzzwords. We need to be able to apply those, apply that knowledge to MCQ questions. And also, I think going through the case study exams, the use of those buzzwords is very, very important. If I was to mark a case study paper, I'd be looking, for example, under related and supporting industry, I'd be looking for the student to mention clusters, mutual support, those sorts of phrases. That's where you'll score marks. MCQ questions are a little bit more low level at E2. I think you'll find that a certain amount of rote learning will give you quite a few marks in most of the questions. There'll probably be 20 to 30, maybe 40% of the marks will be more higher level. Okay, so the key thing in relation to the model as mentioned is learn the elements of it. Okay, apply it to as many questions as you can and really repeat that process. So moving on from there, in terms of the real life example, now I've mentioned Germany, and I think that's probably the best example that we could use in this particular case. So what I've done here is just outline the main factors again, the main areas of the model, and just give you one or two ideas in relation to, well, why is it that the German car industry is so successful and has been so successful for many years? Under factor conditions, I've just picked out its geography. So in other words, the geographical location of Germany in Central Europe, well placed to export to different countries, neighboring countries throughout Europe and beyond. So you'll think that it just had a little bit of an edge over perhaps another country, perhaps England, for example. Over and above that, technical know-how. The Germans are known for their technical expertise. And if you imagine with the design and build of a car, having that as under your belt, as it were, just gives you that little bit of an edge over a neighboring country. Now, there's a certain amount of overlap between factor conditions and related and supporting industries. One of the things you'll see is that there was certainly a certain amount of support or degree of support between industries involved in iron and steel. You'll imagine a set of clusters, groups of companies that were involved with the development of the German aircraft industry, and then moving to the 1920s will have assisted in the development of the car industry. If you imagine, components for cars and indeed components for aircraft, not dissimilar. In terms of the demand conditions, certainly the impact of the Nazi government was sizable in the 20s and 30s within Germany, and you'll note that production of cars grew from 350 over the course of the 1930s. There certainly was a high demand, but I should remind you what I said about this area of demand conditions. It's not just the volume of demand, it's the sophistication as well that's important. In terms of the strategy, structure, and rivalry, obviously it's intense rivalry. You only have to look at the list below to see the number of car brands who will have come about in the 1920s, 30s and 40s, but certainly that area of quality, that was the key strategy for German car manufacturers at that time. It was driving up quality, that was impacted upon by sophisticated consumers. Okay. So in terms of the practice MC questions, I've set this up for you in basically two ways. The first area here is just the question itself. I'm just going to give you a moment just to look through that question. You'll see that in this particular case, we're asked to look at 4 key areas here, and we're asked to really split them between basic and advanced factors. So it's a sort of mid-level difficulty question. I've annotated after each question the answer. So on the next page here, you'll see that what we really must do is break down the question itself. Okay, in other words, what are the areas of the question that we need to understand? I mean, certainly we know they've mentioned Porter at the outset, so we know what's coming. Competitive advantage is all about edge over rivals. We see basic versus advanced. That should be familiar to us if we've done some study in this area. And we see that these contribute towards the success of the particular nation in relation to a good or service. So if we look down the list of 4 here, I'd draw your attention to this rule over on the right-hand side. In other words, the basic factors are naturally occurring and advanced factors are man-made. So if we scan down this area of the question, we'll see that there's really only one area here that is naturally occurring, and that is the coastline and the river system. So that must be B. Each of the other factors, education, that's certainly man-made. Comms, that's man-made. Road and rail system, that's man-made. So not overly difficult here, just A, B, A as the answer. Note also here, I've mentioned just to assist you that certainly no investment is needed in basic factors. They are naturally occurring. They are already there. Okay. Next question, just to give you a look at the mechanics of it first. It looks like we're talking about leather footwear in Italy, and they mention different types of industry or different types of players within that industry, leather working and design. And it looks like all that they're asking us to do is to identify which area of the diamond do these come into play with. And I think that's a fairly sort of low-level question. So if we look at the breakdown of the answer, I've said to you, please do remember clusters. So when we see several different industries or several different players within a given industry, we see, well, these people are sort of related. Perhaps there's some elements of mutual support between them. Maybe they're benefiting from each other. So they've simply asked, which part of the diamond does the above relate to? And again, I think that's reasonably straightforward. It's got to be related and supporting industries. One point I'll draw your attention to here is the idea of the proximity of suppliers. In other words, if you have the opportunity, perhaps you're working within the leather footwear industry, if you have the opportunity to, deal with or liaise with a supplier who's in a nearby town or perhaps in the same town, it's a lot easier than dealing with someone who's outside your own country. So proximity is important, location is important, and where you have clusters or pockets of related industries, it just makes that industry more, it makes it easier for players within that industry to develop their business more quickly. Okay, so finally, a sort of a summary and recap for you here. I've got sort of 5 key points for you. Really, the first one is that, Porter's diamond is about competitive advantage. What does that mean? It basically means an edge. It's about how companies in particular industries gain a comparative edge over countries or firms in another nation. What you've got to do is to learn the determinants or the elements of each of the model and learn what they mean. Remember the buzzwords, they're important, e.g. clusters and indeed sophistication. Absolutely central to your success, not least in MCQ questions, but also in your case study exams. Do try to apply your knowledge to real life. That will help you get that deeper level understanding. And certainly make sure that you practice questions as often as possible. The core to any exam for me, of all the students that I've taught over the years, the core is to practice. And, for Porter's Diamond or Porter's Value Chain or even Porter's 5 Forces, what you'll find is the more questions that you do, the more quality time that you spend trying to understand what Michael Porter is talking about. When you see the questions in the exam, you'll actually find some of them fairly straightforward. So really, hard work is important. All of these models are important. Please do ensure that you manage to do as many questions as possible. Many thanks for your efforts.